Welcome to The Bold Blueprint, a podcast for modern educators who dare to think differently. Here we explore the intersection of education and leadership, diving into bold strategies, innovative teaching, and the mindset shifts that drive real impact. Whether you're in the classroom, leading a team, or shaping the future of education, this is your space to learn, grow, and lead with confidence. Hey Barbie, here we are again. How you doing?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. A nice kind of overcast Tuesday here in Sydney today. How are you going?
Well, I'm enjoying the fact that that we can actually get out our jumpers and our cooler clothes at the moment. I have to tell you, winter's one of my favourite times of year, and it just feels like it's just around the corner.
I feel like you live in the wrong spot for that.
I know. I think we get like 2 weeks of a little bit of crispness in the Gold Coast, and I embrace every single moment of that.
I think someone on our team was talking to someone your way, and they were saying how cold it was, and it was like 21 degrees. And it's sidetracked on that, but it's like, I guess that is a assumption that 21 degrees isn't cold for them because it's so different here. But
right, I know. We've got an operation manager down in Tasmania at the moment. I think she said it was like 4 degrees, and I think I shared previously. I used to live in the Blue Mountains, and I do miss those. The having the fire happen and smelling the fire in a house going through the chimney. It's quite a beautiful moment, and I miss that. But here we are. We're going to be talking about assumptions today, the silent saboteurs of education and care. Assumptions.
yes.
What do you think about that?
Yes, and that's why I tried to sneak in the temperature assumption that 21 isn't cold for someone. It can be cold for someone. Just like in Tasmania, they probably think 20 is boiling hot. Yes, definitely. We spoke briefly just off this, and I said we probably should be recording this because as you start, sometimes when you're kind of planning a podcast, it's like you don't know where to start, and then it keeps just branching off of, oh yeah, there's an assumption here, or I've experienced that, or I've seen that, or other references. But I guess we all make them whether we like it or not. Even if we say we don't, we do in some way or another. But I guess for this episode, I guess it was, what if those assumptions are harming the very people we aim to support? Yeah. Children, young people, families, educators, and even ourselves. I'm guilty of that one, probably, of that last one. And then as we were talking beforehand too, it was like, oh gosh, where do we start diving into this one?
Barbie, can I tell you a story? I mean, being a guy in early childhood education and care for as long as I've been doing this, and I'm lucky enough that it's taken me to work in different countries, and I couldn't imagine working in any other sector outside of this space and the outside of school hours care space. And I know we've known of each other for so long now, and I have to tell you that there's been a lot of assumptions about me being a man in early childhood. And I haven't ever had the negative connotation. I've always been really embraced and all of that. But it's quite interesting when I go into services, how children are drawn towards me, and that interaction and those kind of relationship-based aspects. Sometimes people say, oh, the children really enjoy you being here because you're a male. And I sometimes pause and I think to myself, well, is it because I'm a male, or is it because I actually get down on the child's level and I engage them? And maybe there's probably a bit of I don't know, maybe there is a bit of a thing about children being, coming to someone who might be different to everybody else, or, hey, it's good to have a male in the team because it might stop the bitchiness and things. And I always think, wow, that's so insulting to our women workforce, because all of my mentors across my years of experience, actually every single one of them except for one, were actually my guides and mentors to be the person I am today. So I think that sometimes there's quite a lot of assumptions. Why can't we have a good dynamic team and without the toxicity when it's just a female-dominated space? And is it true that women are more toxic in the work environment, and you need to have a male in there to kind of break that up? And just because you're a man or a guy in the sector, does that mean that you're going to be developing better relationships with children than women? I don't know if that's true. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
I have to admit, since having children, it's like I probably was, I guess, that assumption, and being female, saying that it's probably more toxic because it's like that 95% female. And I could see a big difference with more males in a service. I used to have more than 50% males at one point. But then as you're talking, I wrote down it's not that. It's just because that's the outlier, and on the face value, looking at it, that looks like it's the difference. But I think it all came down to personality.
Well,
Like,
I reckon I'm a great educator because I'm a great educator.
yeah. And that, like you're talking about the assumptions, like I know there's assumptions out there that male educators, you're so lucky you actually haven't come across those negative assumptions. I've seen it a lot towards our staff, especially from families.
Yeah.
But then there's also that understanding of what they all used to, whether they're just newly arrived in Australia and in their country, no males work in the childcare space, let alone teaching space. Like there's so many differences. But
I will say, Barbie, I know I shared my story in my first year of working in the sector, being the trainee. That owner, the boss, the leader, sat me down and it stayed with me, saying, "You are a male in early childhood. You need to be careful about the perspective and assumptions of why you're in this space, and have some self care, safety, protective measures." And that has always stayed with me. That is true.
yeah. And I know when I reflected on our own team, even though it was more male, so that's what it felt like was the difference that flowed, but it really was the personality. And we were talking off air before about like that kind of bias around I'm going to miss what it was called, but it had a familiarity bias. So it could be we naturally gravitate towards people, practices, or methods that feel familiar to us, and that's all that could be. Not necessarily that there was males there that made that. That was that culture, the personality groups that were in there. And then same with there was a lot of assumptions I found in our team that the male educators for some reason didn't clean. Like it was just so archaic on that thought. Whereas one of our most incredible, tidiest people we had on the team was male. Like he was beyond amazing. It wasn't just clean, it was reorganized, better layout, better set out. It wasn't just like a surface level type thing. So that's such a minor level in the assumption. I know for yourself, when you shared your assumption, I have one too, and it's staring me right in the face, and I always forget. It's my name.
Your name?
Yeah, my name. And then younger, I was blonde, naturally younger, like white blonde plus skinny plus called Barbie. And then that Barbie Girl song came out when I hit year 7 in 97. It makes it easier to remember what year's what. And that has nothing to do with me, but then the assumptions on you just because that's your name. The amount of people tell me that, like, I call myself that. It's like, no, my mum did it. She couldn't spell properly. There's no E on the end. And just so many assumptions around it, purely just from a name. A name I didn't give myself, a hair color I didn't give myself when I was young. I do add to it now I'm older, which obviously has nothing to do with who I was, but I think it does help, whether positive or negative. Those assumptions do build who you are, or can build, because then you might take on some of them yourselves and where you're heading, pending where they come in your life.
And then what about your connection to your name now? Do you have a positive connection to your name now, or is that something you're
Yeah.
like wanting to change that?
No, if anything, because when I was born, my grandmother thought it was a silly name. I'm not letting your mum put that on the birth certificate, that Barbara is on my birth certificate, and I hate that. So the only change I ever wanted to do, and I still think about it now, is to change it from Barbara to Barbie legally on, like, say, the driver's license says that. But otherwise in life, at home and everything, I never got called that. Maybe once if I was in trouble by my grandmother or something, but that was it. It was never actually my given name. Purely, I was named after a doll. That's genuinely where my mum got it from, the Barbie doll, and
Yeah.
she just couldn't spell it properly at the time. But I don't mind that point of difference, no E on the end. But I like it in the sense that hated in high school. Went to a girls' school too. Lovely time. Think it helps build resilience maybe. But I like it in the sense of them working in the education space for 20 years. It, I think, was a benefit, like it was an asset. Adults have that bias towards the name, but the children's bias towards the name was so different. It was more positive. As in, I felt like they were more at ease to come approach me. They remembered my name easier, even if you just fresh started for the day, because it was something familiar to them in their world, in the play space. And
Yeah,
then that knock on, I guess, 20 years in education, it's a lot easier to use Barbie. It's very memorable in what we do now in business.
yeah,
A lot of people remember it because they must associate it with something.
of
Um,
course.
in the point of different phase. And I have to admit, I didn't mind the Barbie movie when it came out a few years ago for helping the name. I'm like, oh, that's not as bad as the old Aqua Barbie girl song kind of insinuation of what Barbie is. So
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, no, I totally get it. My name is named after my dad, so but it's James. So when I'm in trouble, James is my name. But that's why I get called Jamie. But on my license, it's James. But having a separation from that, I think, is important. But I digress. I mean, today our key topic is assumptions, and I guess thinking about that, our names are so important to who we are. It really becomes our identity and understanding, where children are at and our people that we work with and our families, and getting to know who they are on an individual level. But, just shifting the narrative just a little bit, Barbie, I know
mhm.
we just watched a bit of a thing that was on the news. ABC just released some images of an educator in a classroom being filmed, um, slapping a child across the face and laughing. And it was
Mm.
an educator within me, and to yourself, Barbie. It was interesting seeing you watch that in live reaction. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you just seen.
Oh yeah, like I said, I was like, oh, we should have been recording as I watched it, but then also literally like a minute before we logged on here. So if I ever seem tense, it's probably me, and I've got it on this screen still remembering what I just saw. I somehow was not naive to it, but just missed it yesterday. Mum Live hadn't been online, social media, watched any news. And I did notice when I was dropping off one of my children today at the early learning centre, I'll have to ask them when I go back, is it because of this? There was a new sign on the front door saying, like, no unauthorised photography allowed. Um, and I registered it because there's so many signs in there, but I'm like, oh, that's quite a different one to usual. And then coming here, I'm like, oh, this is probably what that is, but I will ask the director when I go back. Um, gosh, you probably saw my face shock watching it. It's like my mum brain kicks in. Plus, I know for myself, which I'm still learning now at 40, anytime I see things like this, there's kind of a trigger from my own childhood. Like, there's a lot of memories I don't have, but I've been told that when I see or hear of things that could be like similar, I can get a different trigger as well. So I know that would have happened too when watching it, but I probably disconnect myself from
Yeah,
in that sense. So there's definitely that shock, but I hate saying it, that I'm not surprised. Is that like, that's probably the unspoken side of, it's bad that I shouldn't be not surprised that things like that do happen out there. I think it's why people like yourself and I kind of just persevere and do. Um, we're very child focused in what we do, and this is one big reason why. Whether it's the right people, the right structure, the right approved providers, like, and yeah, there's so many other layers to it to help.
I totally agree. And, I shared that article with our team at Early Learning Management. And, we are doing a complete compliance blitz and doing
Mm,
visits and making sure everyone's done their training. And, we've got no association at all to anything that has occurred. And I'm really proud of the work that we do with the systems and everything. But the knee jerk reaction was naming the organization that the ABC link came to and said, of course, it's that organization that yet again we're focusing on. If we talk about assumptions, I don't see the organization themselves recording that video on Snapchat or the things that was in the recent Four Corners article. And there could be real clear debate around for profit and for purpose and how that kind of comes together, right? And I think there's definitely a space for all. And I know I've worked in non-for-profits, parent-run committee organisations, big corporates, and individually owned operators who have multiple services as well. So I personally have seen every aspect of our sector, and I know you have as well, Barbie, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I also feel, and my personal belief is, if we were to assume and make assumptions, right, sometimes when an educator comes into our classroom, we assume, one, they've been trained, they've been inducted, that they've got the experience in the backing, and have making sure that, appropriate behaviours are happening in classroom settings. And I have to tell you, I don't think we can assume anything, right? And I'm wondering how we can unpack what that might look like when an educator comes into our classroom for the very first time, to ensure that if I'm the room leader, or if I'm a lead at an outside of school hours care setting, what can I do within my power? Yes, we might have other children in the space. Yes, we might be busy and all this stuff, but this idea of child first, child led, making sure that we're thinking about the important aspects of what's in that classroom setting. I have seen time and time again, I have to tell you, lunch breaks are about to happen. The lunch break float comes in, and then the other person goes on a break. Like, are we actually spending time to make sure we're communicating effectively with that kind of crossover? Or even when someone comes in the room for the first time, are we actually showing what's happening in that space? But this also comes down with the fact of, from an assumption perspective, that people have been trained effectively. People
Mm-hmm.
trained around the right processes and protocols of what we should have in services, that we are actually living and breathing the policies around not having personal mobile phone or electronic devices in a classroom setting, that if we do see some of these practices occurring, that we're confident to advocate, to say that's not acceptable. You're not to have your personal device in a classroom setting, and not have a worry and a fear to have retribution. But I guess what I'd like to kind of unpack is the assumption of, this for profit and mixing with purpose, and
Mm-hmm.
what that might look like in a classroom. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and Barbie, I'd love to hear it.
No, I see the same, and especially my background is a not-for-profit background. I don't know if we've touched on it before too, because we keep seeing it, like a lot of this target at the not-for-profit space. Um, and I feel I don't like the target towards one, whereas see it as a whole, because this is a cultural thing. It was sent to a Snapchat group. It had the emoji and everything on it. It isn't anything internal. I mean, unless it's encouraged by upper management, it's still a cultural thing. It's not necessarily a for-profit or a not-for-profit. It's completely separate to that. Um, and so that assumption on that I don't like, because it doesn't mean then I don't want less scrutiny on the not-for-profit in a cultural sense, because I've still experienced I have quite negative experiences in that area as well as a mother. And
In the
that's why
fat negative.
yeah, in the not-for-profit side. So, and then that knock-on effect to my daughter. Um, and then so I got my mother lens that doesn't want that to be the narrative, because I don't want to see the not for profits to not be held to the same standards. I think that's how I was trying to say it in a more roundabout way. Like, and especially there's that other assumption about safety, that if a service is regulated, it must be safe. As a parent, regardless of not for profit or profit, I do know, talking with parents, there is this kind of push they have, not from within the space, to try and seek out the not for profits because of the things like this they see. Um, Again, that goes with that narrative. It doesn't mean it's the right answer to it, and it's again that cultural team awareness. Again, there was a Snapchat group. There's more than one. I'm sure that wasn't the only incident.
Yeah.
I'm sure they've investigated, but people delete stuff. Because I guess it overlooks that not-for-profit services can also experience issues with poor practice, lack of training, or unsafe environments. It's not just in one type of approved provider. It can be in any.
No, I can completely agree. I know when I worked for, and I don't want to go down this whole path of non-for-profit, for-profit, all this kind of stuff, right? Because even non-for-profits still have to make a profit, or
Hmm.
other no service. You know?
Yeah, you got to pay your bills still and your staff.
Exactly. And I know when I worked in a non-for-profit space in Coogee in Sydney, I know that I was by myself as the coordinator of a large outside of school hours care service. And just because I'm a networker and a connector, I made sure I went to the eastern suburbs local networking group every single month, by myself, and I took the initiative to do that. And what it came out of that is that I was networked with a whole variety of other people. But sometimes in this space, there isn't those networks and there isn't that governance. Imagine if I, as the coordinator, in 2005, 2007, like I didn't want to network with anybody else, stay in my space. I wouldn't have any of their governance. I wouldn't have other people coming into my service or my space, except for the educators and families, right? And I think the benefit of the for-profit space is that typically there would be an operation manager or other people coming into services, having learning management software programs, having rigorous policies, procedures, training platforms. But you can have all the training and platforms in the world, but if they're not being used effectively, well, what's the point? It's like having an online, digital checklist or an online quality improvement plan or all these wonderful tools that are at our fingertips that if they're not being used, what's the point, right? And I think we spoke at one episode about like what would we do if we changed the sector, and I understand that we are so heavily bogged down by paperwork that I think sometimes, in my perspective, as an assumption, that what we sometimes forget is what does good quality care and interaction look like in a classroom setting, and how do we have the mentoring programs and protocols that people are out of the office and actually in classrooms modeling what that might look like. And how do we ensure that we've got the governance over that? And I know for myself, when I'm quite proud of being a relationship guy. I always have been. It's within my fabric of who I am. But I know that I've seen leaders lead from the office, not ever leaving the office, not even knowing all the families' names. Making sure that we're going across the classroom setting, observing practice, and having a culture. And I'm wondering, Barbie, how we can kind of give our listeners some of the hot tips about how do we help our educators, if something doesn't feel right, how they can talk to others to make sure that they're advocating for this idea of service. Because honestly, I agree. Seeing that Snapchat video, it didn't shock me, and I know that we need to have this conversation around safety and good quality care and services, and it's clear that rightly it's the job of the media to put spotlight on these issues, and we've got to focus on that. But I'm wondering, I don't know, Bobby, when you were in centres, is there anything that you might have seen that worked that maybe we could give some hot tips? Barbie's
Yeah,
hot tips.
especially what you said before. I write things as you talk. When you were talking about what good quality care looks like, and that
Yeah.
going around and mentoring and just being involved with everyone, whether that is still being used at the same scale. It's like services are getting larger and larger. And I was talking to Jane's husband, Jamie, James, too many James in the world.
Sorry.
That just the other day it's a fact the services are just going to be large. That's just, especially us, we're in Sydney. I feel like there's quite large USH services your way, and I can only assume same with early learning as well. But it's just then how we work with a different model, that there's still that old model that there's one leader, one nominated supervisor for many. There are some that do others, one director that then oversees the service, whether it's 20 kids or 200 children. And I was talking to James about it. It's like we drove past a large early learning service that's just been built near us, and it's huge. It looks like a hotel. But looking at it on the outside, I'm like, man, if I was running it with my imaginary hat, it's like you could split it into 4 different services, and like just a different way of looking how you manage things. Like it's almost like mini little services within a big one to then help with the culture side. That was just
You know
me
how I
on there.
And I know I don't. I know we've got to be protective of our space. I'm not referencing something, but this idea, you're not Woolies and Coles or any Audi or whatever. There's like department managers, like the deli
Yeah,
has a manager and the bakery has a manager and there's a floor manager, but there's an overall leader. But there's still different sub kind of teams within the team.
yeah.
So
Uh,
kind of that's what I'm thinking you're talking about.
Yeah, because I still think everyone still leaves a lot to the director because we see burnout a lot, and there is a lot of responsibility with that. And then as your service gets bigger, there's more families, there's more staff, there's more children, there's more little knock-on things that can happen and to be abreast of. Whereas it's like not always being a gatekeeper as such as one person, like it can be a shared responsibility. I was talking to another service and they have multiple, three nominated supervisors, not an overly large one, but just how that works with that culture. It can scare off people wanting to work there, but for why they do it, it's just brilliant. And more people, I do see it more and more now coming up with multiple nominated supervisors and rethinking how that looks or how the leadership of the service looks to help with that cultural flow. Because also with these larger services, it's impossible for one person to do it all. I know for myself, when we had 150 place service, but the 80% of the school came and it was close to 400 children were enrolled at
Oh
the
yeah,
service. So you might see one kid once a term or something,
yeah.
but one person can't keep on top of all of that. So
No, and that's true. And I think, I mean, we've talked heavily in previous episodes about this, that the nominated supervisor is one person, and typically they've not been trained in the leadership capacity. And, I think while we're talking a lot about what's happening in the classroom setting, and, I do think there needs to be, a perspective and a culture of what does it look like in my lived classroom? What am I doing if someone new is in the room? How I am orientating and and I would do a mini challenge, and my mini challenge to all of our listeners is you might have a communication book in your room that you have, or maybe you don't. You might need to go get one from Kmart or some shop and put what are the top 10 things that you want to make sure when someone enters your classroom that you want to tick off that you've covered those. Have you showed where all the medical action plans are? Have you showed if there's EpiPens in your space? Have you shown them any behaviour guidance plans? Have you shown and spoken about what the program is and how that routine and the flow of the day is functioning? Because I have to tell you that there's also an assumption that our centre managers and our nominated supervisors are doing all of these things. And I'm not saying they're not doing their job, because sometimes there's an assumption, and I guess there's a bias that it's lonely at the top. And I that can also be a bit tough where, there can sometimes be, we talk about bullying in a workplace setting, and we're talking about the assumptions of making sure that we've got all the right processes in place to make sure this idea of safety of children's occurring and we're using those. But I have to tell you, sometimes people are pretty ruthless towards that centre manager and nominates. Like, that's a tough gig. Like, if you think about it, there's only usually, to your point, one or two people in that centre. They don't have anyone else they can bounce ideas off. And I know that the expectation of a centre manager, and I've heard stories where, of course, centre managers and nominated supervisors and coordinators don't always get it right. And I think leadership's all about self-reflection, and leadership starts with self. But how about also having the back of the nominated supervisor to say, are you okay? What can I do to support? And, we talk about, as I just said, bullying in the workplace and having that toxic environment. I mean, I've seen some tough stuff happen towards centre managers over time. I don't know if you have, Barbie, but that's an assumption to think that sometimes bullying or something can come from a power dynamic of a top down, but sometimes it can be reverse engineered, right?
yep, yep. And is that we spoke briefly about this off air too, of that, yeah, bullying isn't always from the top down, leadership down, that it definitely can be from the reverse. And then the assumption, because it's the other way, it's like the other, if it goes from whether it's peer to peer or up, it's not always as much noticed. Like it's like a leader tends to wear it all think of, wait, what are they do? Like what are they doing that they could do differently? Like, what's their management style? Is it not connecting? When sometimes the person's just being I don't know what PG word I can say, but you can fill in the blanks there. And again, that's that cultural. As we've been talking to, like, so many of these things, because there are so many assumptions, and then of course the negative things that affect the children's safety, like that video. A lot of it does seem very related to the cultural landscape of a service and how that's maintained. So I was trying to. I wrote it when we were talking, but I've
Well, just jumping in there, just for like another little mini challenge that I would encourage educators is, if you've got your typical team meetings that happen on a monthly or a quarterly, or even if you go above and beyond and you do weekly room meetings, so I know sometimes when I've run meetings as a leader and you say, does anyone have anything they'd like to talk about? And everyone goes radio silent. But that silent saboteur that's in that team, that there might be things that need to be discussed and talked about, or even putting a hand up and saying, hey, I've seen some stuff. I'm not targeting anybody, but can we have a conversation? In this conversation, I'm just going to bring this example up about using electronic personal devices in our center. What do we all agree to as a team in that group environment, that these are our kind of boundaries that we want to talk about? I know it's a scary space, and I sometimes need to remind myself, being quite a confident person, I'm quite okay advocating and talking about this idea, but I've got to remind myself that it can be quite tough, in a team environment, bringing up something that might be a bit controversial or have a different perspective, and not want to come across as alienating or, going against the grain. But and that's my personal assumption that I'm making right now in this exact moment. But I also put a little mini challenge, not just from a communication, making sure there's little inductions in centres, in classrooms that you might tick off. But when you go to team meetings actually effectively, the housekeeping. Let's make sure we turn the lights off, and we done the closing checklist, and let's remember and tick a box. So yes, we do staff meetings, but how can we have robust critical reflection and professional development in these spaces that might bring more alignment in that space? And it doesn't matter if you're a trainee Cert 3 or all the way through, developing a voice within those team meetings is sometimes good. And the way I normally, Barbie, get around that is, my advice is, talk to the center manager before a meeting. Like, don't just trigger that in the moment, because you want to have some discussion and dialogue with your center manager, maybe knocking on the door, or if they come into your classroom, say, hey, can I just talk to you about the agenda that's coming up? Can I add something to that? Or I don't feel really comfortable about bringing it up, but could you put that for me? Because I want to talk about that as a team. And, if we think about culture, if we're getting shut down and those things are not being addressed, then that is a broader problem in my perspective. That's an assumption again, but it could be about giving some good tools and building that toolkit of confidence. And if you build that from early on in your career, that's actually a great muscle memory that you're going to go back through from a leadership perspective, making sure we're advocating and looking at where some of the concerns might be. And you might even go to your center manager and even put it on yourself, if you don't want to pinpoint anybody, and say, I need a bit more training around, interactions with children. Could we maybe at the staff meeting talk a bit more about that with some real life examples and some case studies? And how can we have a good critical reflective moment in that, which ultimately is exceeding themes, by the way, because if we embed practice from that, that's a good kind of process. But, I just wanted to kind of raise that a little bit from an assumptions perspective around our team meetings, and also that it doesn't always need to be a center manager that, comes up with the agenda, right?
No, not at all. And I loved how you worded it, how the educator might come with the question of, like, they just want more guidance on something, but then in the group setting, because then they might not want to ask it in front of anyone, pending if they don't want to, or they might want to cover it and check in with you. There could be people that are a bit shy to ask it in front of others. And then we talked to the assumption early on that just because they're kind of qualified or experienced, there's that assumption that they have that knowledge. but it depends where they've worked and what they've experienced. It could be something completely new to them, and they haven't been through that before. But it's as you explained it before, it sounds like something so simple that can, and as you mentioned, exceeding practice, really help shape that culture of your service, that the educator feels safe and heard.
Yeah.
And it's important making sure, even if it's something that you feel like, hang on, we've discussed this like 100 times, like, how don't you know that? There's a reason they're coming to you with it. It could be the way it's talked about isn't just sitting, or maybe there's some reason, like it could be a coincidence they've just missed that for some reason, or their induction may have been missing a part, or whoever was doing it with them. Like, there's just so many knock-ons. I also found where I saw a big gap in knowledge in my own reflection and in the service we worked in. It was, I had a really good leadership team, but that were also very reliable. Like, they needed to have more days off, because it got to the point, if they were off, people didn't know what to do because they were so good that the others weren't relied upon as much, that it was like, oh, there's that knock on of like, oh, okay, it's just they haven't been necessarily showed or had to do this yet, even though they may have worked there like 5 years. It's just a good problem of a too reliable team. Like, there's just little things like that. Like, it's not necessarily that person. It's just they've never been asked to do A or B, or seen it happen, because it could be something that someone's done this whole time that it just happens so quickly you don't realize it's something that's just there's just so many things in the background of the center. I was trying to think off the top of my head, like back then when it was paper rolls, like making sure all the paper rolls matched up for the day. Like,
And an entry.
yeah. Or we used to print. Oh, I missed that one. Sorry.
That's all automatic now, but I agree. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, and then even that automatic side, they might not realize, like, someone might want to double check. They know he called earlier. They want to make sure that booking's been updated. Like, there's all those little things in the diary. You might need to double check a authorized collector's been added, like, into the program. And because you can't physically see it now, like, because we used to have little paper slips, you could see when the pile had been completed, whereas now you have no idea. You've got to go log in and do it, so it's not, even less visible to then if you need an educator to help with something like that. Again, that says how long I've been working in the professional, the paper
Oh,
slips to update.
gosh, I totally get it. Like, I think we all make assumptions, like, but what if those assumptions are harming the very people, that
Yeah.
we're aiming to support? We think about children, families, educators, and even our own assumptions of ourselves, like sometimes I've seen, I'm not now making an assumption, I'm actually making a generalized approach that people may have studied a degree, an early childhood teaching degree, and that's all very theory-based learning. And even that you've done that deep research and you've got that degree, and it's like, I've got a degree and I'm maybe one of two potentially people in the service that's got that degree and piece of paper. You may not have the practical application and the experience behind you, because you may have just come out of university. So some people may even have assumptions about what that might look like in a classroom setting, and making sure that can translate for that deeper research, thinking approach. But I absolutely can see that as a team, we all make assumptions, and we talk about culture. And if we think about that, I do agree with what you're talking about, that assumptions is a personal viewpoint. It is, I'm assuming an idea and a concept either hasn't, or should happen in a way that I believe it to be true. And I also think over my years, what I've learned is that, leadership starts with self. And sometimes we think people are in a leadership role just because they're in a role and they've got the center manager or the nominated supervisor title or an approved provider. But actually, think about children. Do children not think, even being a Certificate 3 trainee, 18, 19-year-old, that you are not that child's leader? Do you know what I mean? Like, this idea that leadership isn't just based on a title. It is based on a perception and perspective of what that looks like. So if a child looks at you, I don't know about yourself, Barbie, but there's been many times over the year, I'm outside of a centre and I'm down the road at the shopping mall, and then a child sees me outside that lived experience. They're like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? You know, children think that you are the centre, and you don't belong, or you don't actually have a life outside of the center. But if we think about this concept that leadership starts with self, it is sometimes a little bit of a personal challenge to stop, pause, reflect, and see multiple perspectives, and also understand that potentially we've actually got more power of what we can do in a center than we actually even realize. Just because there's a voice around this is the way we do certain things, and yes, maybe there's a bit of a narrative of this is how we do it, but in fact, we probably have a lot more power in our day-to-day decision making than we actually truly realize that we do. But it's also about ensuring that we've got the toolkits to be empowered to go, you know what, I could create a little checklist in a communication book that if anyone comes in my room, I'm going to make sure that everyone's going to be inducted because I can take control of that. I can make sure that if we've got a program or a daily routine, that we're going to be able to cover that, and we can be a child-led program and put great initiatives and classroom settings and environments, and the checklists are all occurring and the daybook stuff. Like I think as a sector, sometimes assumptions, it can be a good thing. We assume that children are going to be in our classroom every day, and we're going to have families drop off their children, and we can assume typically in January when the babies are starting in a centre, it's going to be pretty hard, and we're going to need lots of Panadol. We probably need a bit of a subscription
for yourself or for the kids.
Sorry, for ourselves. And we can probably assume that we're going to be dealing in the toddler room some biting issues throughout the year, because that's a developmentally appropriate practice. Children are learning how to verbalize their emotions for the first time. So I'm not at all saying that assumptions are incorrect, but I do think assumptions come from what we believe to be true. And
then, yeah. And especially like as you're talking, so it's like assumptions, like this isn't, we talked on some other areas where people probably go to the most when they think about assumptions, but as you're talking, those other assumptions where you know things are going to come, like you assume someone's going to get bitten or start biting because it's developmentally appropriate. But then that's also, I guess, you're risk assessing, you're risk mitigating, you're using that strategic lens on how it all works. And we are meant to do that side of it. And it's, I guess an assumption can also, it's like we need to have the assumptions, but with a critically reflect, I guess, if I want to use exceeding things on maybe where our assumptions are coming from, if things have changed, especially if we've been in the profession for a while, or if we've changed providers. It doesn't mean that the practice, it might be different, doesn't mean it's wrong, and it's working with that, maybe doing your own self-learning on that. There's so many different approaches out there, especially in the early learning space, of how a service might be doing their education. Like, I'm going to rattle off names very wrong, but like Reggio Emilia, de Montessori, like there's just so many different things that may be more suited. This all builds in to the philosophy. And I think each time we talk to, there's so much more. I know when the NQF came in, everyone's like, oh, there's paperwork, but like you can see more and more. And with my parent hat again, I can see more and more why these things have to be there. Like why a philosophy is important. If that philosophy is actually lived and created as a team, that helps a whole bunch of these cultural issues if it's reflected on regularly. And then even same on the health and safety side. I know there's a lot of compliance paperwork there, but as a parent with children with intolerances, not allergies, so they're always changing. I understand now why that medical kind of, whereas as a director before I had children, I'm like, this is so much work. When the NQF came in of like, but with my parent hat on with children that are affected by that, I'm like, I want to give them more, like I want to give them more information. So it's just kind of, I feel like I'm sidetracked there on the assumption side, but we're thinking with it.
Can I give a little assumption of, like, we keep using the word, we've got to like count how many words we've used assumption in this podcast. But I do have a little bit of a tidbit for educators in centres with a child that bites. And this is an approach that I've used forever and a day, and it works. It really, really works. And it's called the scrunchy strategy. So if you're in the 2 to 3 year old room, you might have a muncher and a biter in the room, and of course you're going to have parents who might be upset if their other child's being bitten, and we want to make sure all children coming into our service have a safe and respectful environment. And it's typically just a bit of a phase that children go through, and educators in the 2 to 3 room, a big shout out to all of you. I call that the puppy dog age group. Children are everywhere, and they're a bit like a whirlwind sometimes, and they're very fast moving. They're being able to be mobile and work around, and it's quite a fascinating space. But the scrunchie strategy is where you get a scrunchie, you put it around your wrist, and if you are the scrunchie person, then you're going to be typically around that child, not directly with that child. You don't have to have that child on your lap, but just in close proximity. That if a child was to go and bite, you at least can intervene as quickly as you possibly can. If you go to the bathroom on your lunch break, then you literally take off the scrunchie and go, "Hey, Barbie, you're now the scrunchie person," and then you put it around your wrist. And it also means that there's a respect to that child, that we're not naming and shaming that child and calling that child who bites everybody. Because if we've got consistency in our practice, if we think about that approach, Barbie would take that over mine and then I'd come back, that we will see positive outcomes at the end of that. Now, of course, that's an assumption, but we know based on research that consistency and having a continuity of approach typically will see good positive outcomes. And I think the narrative of everything we're talking about in this podcast is about that we have consistency, that we are all talking, we are all advocates for the child lens and our culture within our space. But assumptions can be a positive, but also there can be a dark side to that as well. Making sure that we're challenging the perspectives and asking questions and coming from that lens, that it doesn't matter what role that we have in our space, that everyone should have a voice and we should be advocating for that culture in our service. But I don't know, I just thought I quite like sharing that really practical tool in services, because sometimes educators just think, wow, how do I work with a child who's biting? I don't know what else to do.
Yeah. And then as an adult, we just get frustrated because we're not that age. So we forget, even though we have that knowledge, we forget what it can be like. I'm talking that as a parent of a 3-year-old. Well, you're like, what are you doing? Even though I have the knowledge of knowing why you're doing what you're doing, I'm still going, what are you doing? It's like,
Children bite at all or no?
we've been pretty lucky, rarely. I feel like if they have, it's only been 1 or 2 times, and probably more so each other. or me. Oh no, maybe dad. It's like, just especially, for one, I think it was when she was really tired or frustrated she couldn't get something, and because the communication is so different. And then being aware and in tune with how they're feeling, and not assuming everyone's had a great night's sleep. Sleep sometimes a huge thing, or breakfast. Maybe they've been rushed out, or maybe they don't have access to it. Again, that's that whole other assumptions on there. But I agree, and the sense of that you might say, like, I was going to say, leadership and care kind of start with curiosity, not certainty, which is what you were just talking about. But even leadership in remembering that, even if you're a brand new Cert 3 educator, there's someone usually looking up to you. It could be a child in your care. It could be another educator that's new on you. There's usually always someone else looking up to you and what you're doing, and not forgetting that in your practices. And not in a daunting way, in a rewarding way of like what impact you can have on others in that sense. Say if you're in that service, like I'm sure people knew about that video that hadn't said anything, but were uncomfortable with it. And I know we need the regulations. We have to have a grievance procedure policy, but as a service on a cultural level, what do you do with it? Is it well known? Is it discussed more openly? I know I see a lot of people that the grievance procedure, it's maybe only the director, whereas I made sure on ours, because what if I was the problem? Like, who are they going to go to? Like, when that was a not-for-profit, so it was a management committee. And then even pending what it was, because we were in the school grounds as a principal, because again, it depends, like, what have you issues with the management committee? And like, you just got different layers built in, so your team knows, even down to reporting. I know for me on a child protection side, in my early days, I got told by the director not to report something, and it didn't sit right with me. But I didn't know back then that we can still do stuff. Whereas, so I remember just working with our team a lot, that even if I say that's not reportable, or even if they go through the decision tree and it's kind of recommending just observe, if you still feel something's not right, still do what you want to do, like in report, like, yeah, there's just all that on trusting your intuition on that side. But yeah.
No, I totally agree. And I mean, if we were to kind of wrap up today, and I've just got some notes that I'm looking over here, and I'd like to ask our listeners, Barbie, a little challenge, and I would love to invite, and I would like to hope to ask a question about identifying one assumption that you can challenge this week. Now, we've spoken about so many different things today, but think about those conversations that happen in the staff room. Think about those conversations that we should have with our loved ones outside of the work environment about our day, right? But I'd love you to really think about an assumption that may or may not be true, and thinking about a different perspective, and also what could you do about it? What's
Mm.
your power that you could make a positive impact and change based on this idea of assumptions in your service? There's so many things we spoke about today, but remember that true leadership can start with curiosity and not certainty, in that we are all leaders in our own right.
Well said. On that side, I was just thinking then, I'm like, how do I write the show description, because it was covered so much in it. But then again, this is all stuff happening out there, as evidence with, unfortunately, that video released yesterday. It's all happening out there. And so it's important to talk about and to reflect on what you're doing, what you can do, whether brand new, being 20 years, 40 years in the profession, doesn't matter, just to continue on that.
Been doing this for a long, long time, you get a bit rusty, right? And fresh ideas and approach, even technology's changed over the years. What we may not know and what we once knew may not be true today. So
Yeah.
because we've done something the way we've always done it doesn't make it right. And just because there's a new way of doing it and a new approach doesn't add additional value sometimes. So it is about thinking about what is in the best interest of children, the team's culture, and being that extension for our families.
Yeah, definitely. And especially with the development of neuroscience over, especially the last 10 years or so, it's so different to what I got taught in university. And again, keeping that curiosity there for better outcomes. I guess that's the simple way. But
Yeah.
I'm always bad at the closing question. It's like I need to write it down and just have it laminated in front of me or something so I don't forget.
Okay, how should we close? I mean, I'm really thrilled that our podcast is now live and it's out and about, and we're getting a lot of listeners listen to this. But I don't know how to close, but I just want to say thanks for everything. I'm loving being on this journey with you, Barbie.
Oh, thank you. I enjoy it too. I think sometimes, yeah, we don't actually prep too much of this. We have different opinions. That's a good thing. It just shows there is different opinions out there. Not an assumption we've all got the same. And we do, if you can't tell, I'm sure you can. we do roll with it as we go. So a lot of what you see is genuinely our thoughts and feelings and ideas in the moment. And I think you've said it before, Jamie, but we love to know what other people want to hear about as well. I did have someone approach me the other day, actually two, one on a phone call, one in person. One was watching it on YouTube and then the other had been listening to it. I'm like, oh, good. And they said they're like ideas. And one was on the educational leader side. They loved that we covered that and said, give them more. That was an ed leader. So, yeah, and another on the phone just said they just like them. I guess we're pretty open. We're pretty authentic in that space. They like that side of it.
Yes.
I haven't even told Jamie that feedback, so that's for you there as well. So keep on going.
Well, I'm excited that Barbie, what's coming soon. So we're going to have some great guest speakers. We're going to be inviting really robust discussions onto this platform, and honestly, we thank every single person listening to us. And yeah, to Barbie's point, please shout out, ask us what you want us to cover. We're here for you, and we're here to bring ideas and concepts to you and your team, and wherever you are around the nation. We hope you're doing well, and thank you for everything you're doing, which is really about making impact and change. Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you. One quick thing, nothing related before we go. Mother's Day on the weekend. Very grateful to have. My daughter gave me 2 hair clips.
Oh,
And
beautiful.
she just found out I'm on YouTube, so I wanted to highlight, thank you for my hair clips, Hayley. I'm wearing them at work on YouTube for you. Nice sparkly pink and purple. So again, thank you for letting me add that in there. And yeah, everyone have a great rest of your day. I really need to figure out my closing line, don't I?
And goodbye.
Goodbye.
And goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Bold Blueprint.
If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach out to us on
elm.net.au or
fireflyhr.com.au.
Bye.
Bye.